Okay, I'm quoting actually from the Tate Modern the little thing they give you when you go to the exhibition, because I think this is incredibly important. It says that, I'm quoting it, seismic social, technological, and artistic advancement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries encouraged many to question the nature of the universe. This is a space to consider how developments across different spheres of knowledge were taken up by the artists, fueling their own artistic developments and outlooks on the world. And this is really very important, because the one thing they had in common, these two, to begin with, I really cannot understand why they put them together, because as I hope you'll see by looking at the images, the effort of working, or the reason for working, was completely different. Mondrian was working with the art world. He knew exactly what was going on. He knew all about Cubism and the whole of the development of the flat plane and the lack of the sort of the old-fashioned perspective. The whole of this he knew about. She had nothing whatever to do with this. As far as she was concerned, her images came from outer space. She was very much involved with a kind of seance group. She first read, and there was a strange sort of mystic writer called Madame Blavatsky. Some of you will have heard of it. Later on, she got equally involved with Rudolf Steiner, who is much better known. But this Madame Blavatsky, actually, she wrote a book about the reasons, the sort of, the only thing you can call it, it was kind of religious, but in a very strange way.
It was a type of spiritualism.
It was spiritualism, but you see, the thing that interested all of the people about was it this particular thing. It wasn't specifically Jewish or Christian or Buddhism, any of those things. It was this theosophy thing sort of said that there was one kind of spiritual something or other determining what was happening.
Was it not derived from nature?
Nature is part of it, but I mean, it was kind of like, it was very strange, but it was tremendously successful as far the idea of this the spiritualism became very, very successful to all of both. Mondrian, Kandinsky, Malevich, all of them were involved to one way or another, and a lot of the writers were too. And so any of the reading that you do between sort of 1890 and about 1910, it fell off. It was taken over by Rudolf Steiner, exactly, and he was much more, he promoted it much more, and his was different. His was called, and I can never say it, Theosophy, I think it was, no, the Theosophy I can say. It's still can't say it, answer something. That was Rudolf Steiner's. But basically, I just wanted to talk about this for the first time to understand what the kind of mental condition that these people were in at that particular time. Okay, let's have the first slide, and you'll see what I've done. Now, I've gone. This is their portraits. They're both actually roughly the same time. Her portrait is roughly 1901, and this is Mondrian in 1906, so there's not much time. Now, of course, he came from Holland and she came from Sweden. She was born in 1862 and she died in, this is something very, very mysterious. All of the people I'm going to be talking about today died in 1944, which is a bit odd. But anyway, she died in 1944. Mondrian, Piet Mondrian, was born in 1872. He was 10 years younger than her, but he also died in 1944. He in New York City and she in Sweden. Now, they didn't know each other at all. And what is exciting everybody is that her work was totally unknown. Now, she became, as I say, she was a theosophist, and she believed that her work was could not be understood by her contemporaries. And when she died, she left it to her great nephew. Now, her name is Hilda Af KLINT. And what I want to explain to you is that Af is like honorable. She came from a very sort of upper middle class Swedish family. In fact, they were all sailors. Her grandfather was the admiral of the fleet, and the great nephew to whom she left all the work was also an admiral in the Swedish Navy. Now, when she left her will, she said on no account was her work to be shown for another 20 years. In fact, it was over 40 years before her work was shown, because she died, as I say, she actually died in, it would be nice if I could, she died in 1944. Now, he eventually got the work it was all over the place. There was an enormous amount of work, and it was also stacked in his house and in the in the attics and in the basements and so on. And he tried to offer it to the Modern Museum of Stockholm. And the minute that the curator found that she was a sort of mystic, and that her work was worked by, she conducted seances, they refused to even look at it. So back it went into the basement again. And very, very strangely, in 1985 and 84, a Swedish art historian got to hear of it, and he went to have a look at it. And he, for the first time, saw the extraordinary work that it was. Now, exactly at that moment, in Los Angeles, they were promoting a huge exhibition of abstract painting. And it was the first in America at that time. And that was going to be done in 1986. And the exhibition was called The Spiritual in Art, Abstract Art from 1890 to 1985. And 10 of her works were shown. Then came the excitement. People were astonished by this work. And finally, she had the first one-man show in New York in the Guggenheim. And so you're going to see images from that particular one here. There it is. Now, this is very, very interesting. Reason I've put this on is the Guggenheim exhibition, by the way, was 2018 to 2019. Now, the reason I've put this on is for two reasons. In her images, the thing that is absolutely consistent is her use of the spiral. Now, remember, we're talking about this being metaphysical in a strange way. And you'll remember that the Guggenheim is also created like a spiral. Now, this is because the mistress of Guggenheim, Hilda Ribe, in fact, Countess Hilda Ribe, who came to America with him, and she became his mistress, and she encouraged him. She was the person who collected so many Kandinskys, and through him, she collected many Kandinskys. And when they decided to build a museum to contain these Kandinskys, it was based upon the spiral movement. So it's very, very suitable that the first enormous exhibition of her work was in the Guggenheim. And I think this is a very interesting one. Now look at the next one. And this is what you see. And you can imagine the shock. There has never been so many people going to an exhibition. It was 600,000 people went to this exhibition, because nobody had ever heard of her. Nobody had ever seen anything about her. And if you look at the basic format of the images, you'll find again the spiral, which was her particular interest. Now, she said that nobody would understand it for 20 years. And the truth of the matter is that still nobody really understands it. But we're going to look at a lot of her work because it was an enormous amount of work. Incidentally, now, of course, Sweden has put together, I think, a sort of a museum, or at least a part of the museum in which her work is always shown. But of course, it's now part of the state. And of course, many, many people make the pilgrimage to Sweden to see it. It's most astonishing because it's not on oil paint. The amazing thing, it's tempera, and it was on paper. And so it's very, 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 very fragile. Now, her background is interesting. As I said, she came from an upper-class family, but she did go to art school. And this in itself is interesting at that particular time, because it was not until 4 years before she went there that the museum art school of Stockholm, which she went to, allowed women. And she was very, very, very good, very, very successful. She won all the prizes, and to such an extent that at the end of her time there, she was given a studio right in the center of Stockholm. And this is where her studio was. And interestingly, below this studio was a sort of a space in which they had international exhibitions. And she would have seen Munch. Now, I've not put Munch on, but I'll just point this out to you. When you're looking at the work, you might find evidences of his work there. It's just interesting to see it. Anyway, here's the next one. And this, of course, is Kandinsky. Now, I've put on Kandinsky because I think her work was most like Kandinsky. The point about it is that Kandinsky is, by all the art historian books, he is the first person to do abstract painting. And the first abstract painting ever made is the painting on the left. And that is actually a watercolor. It has a sort of rather long title. He called it Improvisation and Impression. And it was the first watercolor, it's 1910. And on the second, the one on the right, is an oil painting. And this is now in the Tretyakov, and this is 1913. Now, if you'll remember that Kandinsky came up from a different point. He didn't go to Paris. He was in fact like her. He became older than normal when he first started to paint. And a story he told again and again was that he was trained, actually, it was the wealthy family. I think they were something to do with I think it was fabrics or something, but anyway, there was a lot of money. He was trained as a lawyer, and after he'd finished his training, he was always he always wanted to paint, and he painted and drew from the side. And his story was this: he saw an exhibition of Monet's haystacks, and he was horrified to see that he didn't understand what the painting was about. It was one of the haystacks in the sunset, and it is difficult really to distinguish between the haystack and the background. And he did not know what it was. He was so shocked that he began to look again and again. And that is what he said. Convinced, he then went not to Paris, he then went to Munich, and he became very much involved with the beginnings of German Expressionism, and of course the Blower writer, and particularly the woman Munter. And so his first abstract is coming from the background of German Expressionism, basically. And you know the associations they all had in the village of Merlo. And so that one, the 1910 one. Now, by the time of 1913, he is thoroughly involved in the Blue Rider, and the work is now being shown, and there, of course, of manifestos. Now, I think that he was also interested in theosophy, and I think his work is much more similar in spirit to Hilda HILMA af Clint. Okay, next one. Now, I'm going to show you the beginnings of this. It is really, truly a very, very interesting exhibition. It's interesting because not only are we looking at Clint for the first time, but we're seeing the development of the intellectual development of Mondrian in a way that I've never seen before, which is quite remarkable. Now, what we're looking at, they both started off as landscape painters. By the way, she always, all her life, was known she was quite successful, and she was a landscape painter, and she also did portraits and so on. The business that she did, that we're looking at, was something very private and was never shown to the public. So there's a particular picture on the right is one of her landscapes, and it just is called a lake scene, and it's undated. Now, the one on the left is Mondrian and its evening landscape with cows of 1906. Now, I want you to look at the way at the formal compositions of Mondrian right from the beginning. And as she was interested in the spiral, so you get right from the beginning in his landscapes, his fascination with the horizontal and the perpendicular. You see, if you know, if you've been to Holland, you know basically it's a very flat country, and there's no doubt that it really is the sky and the landscape, which is like that. Okay, let's put the next two on. And here we have we have an interesting pair again. Again on the right, this is HILMA Clint, and this particular one is dated, it's 1890. And the one on the left is Mondrian, and it's the farmers' wives with laundry, and it's 1900 and 1902. Now look at the formal composition. You see the horizontal, the obsession with, look at the washing hanging on the line, and particularly the way the reflections are determined. Actually, one of the things that's so extraordinary, when you go to the exhibition, you are overwhelmed with the beauty of Mondrian's landscapes. They really are quite remarkable. Okay. Now, this is interesting. This again is Mondrian. In this case, we've got two Mondrians, not Clint. And this one is farmstead along the water, waters by the trees of 1905. And the other one is a farm seen through a mist. And this is 1906, 1907. But again, you have this real emphasis on the horizontal and the perpendicular. Now, I'm going to quote you something that she said in her diaries, because this is very important. This is what she said. The pictures were painted, when we're going to be looking at the pictures, the ones we've already seen at the Guggenheim. The pictures were painted directly through me without any preliminary drawing and with great force. I had no idea what the paintings were supposed to depict. Nevertheless, I worked swiftly and surely without changing a single brushstroke. That's what she says, is how her pictures came to fruition. Okay, next two. Now, what we're looking at now is a rather interesting photograph of her as a successful, very successful landscape painter. And this particular picture in the middle is by this very, very, very influential theosophist, although he created his own group, and this is Rudolf Steiner. And the Clint picture is in her studio in Stockholm in 1895. Now, what you're seeing on the right is a picture by several people, by, in fact, 5 women. Now, what she did and what she started was a group of similarly interested women who got together every Friday, and they had a séance. And they met in her studio. They were all painters, and they in the studio there was a sort of a small, it was very Christian, there was a small crucifix on the table, and they sat round a table and they pressed their hands on the table, and sure enough, the group that they called the High Masters contacted them, and the High Master asked them to create a temple, and the only one of the five who showed an interest in creating this temple was HILMA af Klint. And so this is how the whole thing began. But Rudolf Steiner is very important because he at the same time was first influenced by theosophy, and he began to be disenchanted with it because he felt that there was too much Christianity into it, and he wanted it to be completely without that. And so he started his own group, and now I'm going to have a go. It was called, oh dear, I can anthroposophy, and he created anthroposophy, and he started this in 1912. Now this was tremendously successful. I knew some friends years and years ago whose group was part of this group in England, and in England it was very much involved with education, and in this particular case their children went to school, and it was very interesting. It was all over. It was very successful, and he came. This is the mysterious bit. It is thought that he came because he was by 1908 he was internationally successful, and he was visiting all over the place, and he certainly visited Stockholm in 1908, and the idea is, and it's only an idea because they have no real proof, that he visited HILMA af Klint, and she showed him her work, particularly the ones that had been painted through the masters, and he turned them down because he was against this seance business. He felt that this kind of sort of mysticism, was this hallucination, was not serious. And they say that because of that, she stopped painting for about 4 years. So this particular group we're going to see, which are the High Master ones, were painted between 1906 to between 1915. And she is supposed to have met him in 1908. Now, later on in her life, she still was very, very influenced by the same sort of things as he was. And he became so successful that he started up a great organization in Switzerland, and where he died. He died in 1925. And there's no doubt that she visited him frequently in Switzerland. And in fact, she said that when he died, from 1930, I think, until 1944, she was in contact with his spirit. I mention this because this gives you the idea why people find her work rather questionable. Okay, next one.
Did you want me to give a potted version of anthropos?
Oh, please, yes.
Okay, so it comes from the Greek anthropos, which is human. We know that, and Sophia, meaning wisdom. So essentially, it is a in Steiner's own definition, as a scientific exploration of the spiritual world. It postulates the existence of an objective, understandable spiritual world that is accessible to human experience. Obviously, it falls within the kind of pseudo-scientific approach, but the followers claim to present their ideas in a manner that is verifiable by rational discourse, or for example, science, and say that they seek precision and clarity comparable to that obtained by any scientists investigating the physical world.
What he says, he didn't approve of the occultism, which
because
is
that would have been fringe, that's not
Exactly.
verifiable by
Exactly.
rational thought or science.
And that's why they split. So let's put the next one on, and you can see these are, of course, the great group, of which there are 10, and these were painted for the temple, and these are the ones that we saw in the Guggenheim one. And the first, as I say, they were done in 1907. They're enormous, 322 by 290 centimeters. This particular, they seem, in general terms, they are they're sort of a look at life, because these are childhood. The first one on the left is childhood. The one on the right is youth. They're both at the time I said 1910, and her belief is that the colors, the blue is male, and the yellow is female in her ideas. Okay, next one. And here are 2 more. I'm not going to show you many of these, because I've already shown you at the beginning. When you go to the exhibition, of course, you see them all. Let's going to have the one back again just a minute, because this is our adult. These are both adulthood, and they're both 1907. These are 1907, and of course they're made, you see, of tempera on paper. Remember, they're very, very fragile. Now, what she did when she'd finished these, what she said was that the master she painted these through the master. After she'd finished the 10, she said the master no longer told her what to paint, and she painted herself. And she began to make a sort of a series of what she called the blue books, and there were photographs of her images, which she hand colored. And these she did show to friends. Okay, next 2, you can see them. And here's the spiral again. You're going to see the spiral again and again. And this is book 4 to 7. It doesn't really matter. They don't know the date. They're calling it faintly 1907, 1915, but they don't really know. They know that they were done at that particular time. And when she visited him in Switzerland, she took this with her. Now, this is the reason that this is slightly interesting, is that there's no doubt that she took them to show Steiner, and that Steiner actually took photographs of them. And at the same time, he met Kandinsky, and some people believe that he showed KLINT's images to Kandinsky, but this is pure speculation. We really don't know. Okay, next one. These are just an example of these 5 books. This particular one is as I say, 1915, and here you see figures suddenly appearing in them, but they are hand-colored photographs. She did photographs of them all, and there was something like enormous number, and loads and loads and loads of diaries, which she edited all the time. Okay, next one. Now, this is the most interesting, beautiful part of the exhibition, and it's the flower paintings. And these, again, metaphysically speaking, they believe that the flower has got some sort of spiritual significance, but as I'm so irreligious, I can never remember what that particular one is. But the interesting thing is that she did these particular paintings. These were the sort of things that were sold. Actually, in her case, she obviously knew botanical paintings, which were very successful, because they're very light, they're very beautiful. The first one is a nasturtium, and they're all watercolor, by the way. The middle is oak, and the other one is a meadow saxifrage. And these were painted between sort of, as I say, about 1907, 1915. And the difference between her plants, which of course we're going to see Mondrian's as well, is that hers basically were images from the sort of the wild plants of places near Stockholm, and his were on the whole sort of the imported, rather sophisticated plants. Okay, next one. The one on the left is beautiful because this is real. This was taken by Camilla with a photograph. So this is really what it looked like, and it's absolutely exquisite. And this is a gherkin, undated. And this at the bottom here is these two are from a book, and this is from the reality again. Look at the detail in this, and the sense of space is so much better than that. But these two are quite extraordinary, and they're nasturtiums. And the other one is the poppy, again, no date. Now we're going to see Mondrians. And again, these come from reality, from the photograph, from Camilla's photograph. It's the red amaryllis with the blue background in the bottle. And look, this is a detail. They are exquisite, but they are sort of much more paintings than, if you can see, than the rather botanical ones we've been looking at with Hilda von KLINT. They're actually, bless his heart, he was always absolutely stony broke all his life. He had a very, very poor time. He didn't make any money, poor old Mondrian. And all through his life, right into the 1920s, middle 1920s, when he needed some money, he would always paint these single flowers because he could always sell these, and they sold very quickly, and they kept him alive, really. So the dates of these, I say, these are happened to be between 1909 and 1910. Okay, next one. This one on the right is a detail from the real color, and this one comes from a book. We're still Mondrian, we're still looking at Mondrian, and they're absolutely wonderful. It's the golden banded lily. Again, it's 1909, 1910. They're absolutely exquisite. Now, the next two are much later. They're still Mondrian, but they're much later. And this is roses in a glass vase, and these were painted watercolor, and they're certainly after 1921. And again, this is from the reality. This is from a book. And the roses in the vases are painted as late as 1938 to 1940. And as I say, he kept going his life with them, really, his whole time. They're a great success. Go look at the next ones. These is perhaps the most interesting. Now, in 1892, Amsterdam had its first important Van Gogh exhibition, and he saw it, and particularly, of course, the sunflowers. This particular image of the Van Gogh sunflower comes, in fact, from the Met, but at the time it was shown in Amsterdam. And look at Mondrian's images of the dying sunflower. They're almost humanized. They really are incredible pictures of sadness, I think. These are oil on cardboard. They're not watercolor. And they're probably, one is sunflower one, and one they're painted around about 1908, I think. And they're oil on cardboard. Okay, next one. Now these are absolute. This is when it begins to be really, really exciting, because again we're now going through quite quickly. We're going through the development of Mondrian into what we now know as Mondrian. And the first one, the self-portrait, I think is marvelous. He looks rather sort of, it really looks like German Expressionism, doesn't it, a bit? It's in charcoal, it's 1908. Now, next to it, quite simply, I've just put it in because this was the kind of imagery that they were looking at, and this is by a scientist. This particular image is of I suppose, shells and things like this, and it was from a book which we know that Mondrian had. Now the top one I think is absolutely lovely, and this particular landscape with trees is probably 1905, just one at the top. But look what he does now. Look at the beginning of this one here. Look at the forest. Look how suddenly the realism is going. And we're really now looking at the simple vertical, the horizontal shapes. But look at this drawing. We're so fortunate to have seen this. Okay, next one. But this one is very interesting because it appears that all the Mondrian aficionados are deeply embarrassed by this. It's the last time that Mondrian ever painted the nude, and they find it very, very embarrassing. I've actually seen it, and this, incidentally, is the one that came from Camilla's photograph, so it's the real thing. And it's all it's called is Evolution, and it's got these strange flowers on the back. And for some reason, as I say, they're deeply embarrassed. But the one on the right is so beautiful. It is enormous. This top one is absolutely enormous. And it's a dune landscape. Now, you have to know that every summer he went to a place in Zealand, the island of Zealand. And this particular place was a place that he went from 1908 to 1914. And it was a place that most artists went to, and it was wild and completely unknown, but a lot of intellectuals went every year. And this particular dune one, this picture here, which is absolutely wonderful, is enormous. And both these two are Camilla's details. And can you see this extraordinary? It's this piece here. Can you see this here? And this one is here from this bit here. But what I want you to see is what we're doing it. Look at the brush strokes. Look at the way he's painting. He's painting in a very, very, very sort of free way. And this particular one is called Sea After Sunrise, and it's 1909. Okay, next one. They're going to be even stranger. Next one. And these are the dunes. These are just extraordinary. This is the Sea After Sunset of 1909, and this is the Dune 4 of also 1909. And this is when he's really painting. We're beginning to see him. Literally, his work is becoming much more abstract. Okay, next way. These are incidentally oil on cardboard, but nothing prepares us for these. And this is when he's beginning to be involved in art. Now, why? There was an exhibition of the Fauve painting in Amsterdam, and he saw the work of both Duran and Matisse. And this particular one here is the woods near Olay, and this is 1908. But look at the mill in sunlight of 1908. Now, there are many, many, many more paintings of windmills. Now, there's all sorts of reasons for this. They're the only thing in this extremely flat landscape, which is, of course, perpendicular. But also there's another reason, because the new mechanization of the world meant that most of these mills were no longer useful, and so they were dying. They were part of the past, not the future. Okay, next one. But these are absolutely remarkable. This comes from the real thing, as you see here. And this is the Red Cloud of 1907. But nothing can overwhelm us except this particular evening red tree. It is so emotional. It is so incredibly beautiful. Look at the combination of the color and the shape. It really does almost look like an expressionist painting. And from this, he's going to look into trees very, very carefully. Let's look at the next one. Look at this. This is the same time as 1908, 1909, but the grey tree is much later. This is 1912. Now, what happened? in between this and this, he travels to Paris. He goes to Paris for the first time in 1911. And he finds himself a studio in Montparnasse, and it's in a very poor area. But there's an interesting story about this studio, because he uses it all the time he's there, and through this area, this is when he gets to know all sorts of people. But during the war, with the First World War, he continues to pay rent on the studio. So when he finally can come back to Paris after the war, they don't put the rent up, and the prices are all going up. I think this is really rather sweet. But this particular picture on the right is post-Cubism. He has seen Cubism, and he's begun to think about the landscape, not as en plein air as we've been seeing before, but the ideas that come from his drawings, which of course he took with him all the time. Now, he stays in Paris, and in 1914 his father dies, and he goes back to the Netherlands. That was the death of his father, and to his horror and astonishment, of course, the First World War starts. Now, I didn't realize until later that, in fact, the Netherlands did not participate in the First World War, but it meant, of course, that he couldn't go back to Paris. And so we're now looking at a very important time in his life, because this is the time when he gets to know people like Van Doesburg, particularly Van Doesburg, who's much younger than he is. And together they start this movement called Distill, that means, quite frankly, the style. And like all the time, these times, they make a sort of manifesto, but in this case, they have this magazine in which they describe their ideas. And what we're looking at here is the flowering tree of 1917-18, the drawing here. And on the right, the flowering apple tree of 1912. And this is oil on canvas. This is watercolor, of course. This is really quite big. This is 75 by 107. And this comes from the real thing. This is one of Camilla's photographs. Look at the composition. These are wonderful. Now, these are not. These come from books. This is tree one. This is 12-13. We've seen. Remember the one we've seen before? Look at the compositions very carefully. And this is oil on canvas. It's not watercolor. It's again quite large. It's 81 by 62. And on the right, we see what is now going to become his particular style. And this is tree 2, and this is 12-13, but later. And this is 96 by 65. And now finally, we're going to see this one. And these do come from the real thing. You see his signature in the bottom here. Mondrian, 1914. By the way, when he went to Paris and started to show his work, he took one of the A's out of his name. In Holland, it's M-O-N-D-R-I-A-A-N. Took one of the off his name. This is a detail. Now, I want you to look very carefully at the perpendicular and the horizontal. They're not repeated. They're incredibly subtle. They're not quite the same on both sides. It's a very, 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 very carefully considered piece of work. But look at the paint quality. You see, it's much thicker. And quite often you see these take a long, long time, because quite often he'll repaint them again and again and again. You can see in here, you can see that what's happened. These lines were actually painted freehand, these extraordinary lines, and they vary in size. You'll notice the difference in the size of the black lines. They're so beautiful. Okay, next one. Now this one, this is from the real thing, but this is from a book again, I'm afraid, this particular one. And this is a composition in color of 1914. And we are seeing for the first time him using an oval. Yeah. This is composition 3. and the other one is coming Plains 2 of 1914. He actually painted these, of course, in Holland when he was very much involved with the distill movement. And of course, they're completely, they're not known, of course, because there was no exhibitions at all during that war. Okay, next one. Now this is showing you in really investigating color. It's astonishingly subtle. These colors are very, very subtle. They're all very carefully mixed up. And if you look, there's no organized. This is really beautiful. This is composition number 3 with color plaster, and it's 1912. And the Distill magazine, incidentally, just for interest, it was first published in 1917. And incidentally, he'd been looking at pointillism as well. But this particular one, this is composition with a grid of checkerboard, and this is 1919. Now, what happens in 1919, of course, he returns to Paris. He leaves Netherlands as soon as he can, and he goes back to his old studio. As I say, he's very happy to have it still there. And again, penniless virtually, hardly showing with all the other people, but very little money. Okay, next one. This, I think, is such an interesting photograph. This came from the exhibition in the Tate. So this is what you're going to see when you go to the Tate. And this is the current one in the Tate. And this is the work that comes after the 10 largest pictures. And we'll see these in much more detail. These are the KLINT paintings, and these are mostly painted on canvas. And here we see the detail of them. And they're quite large. I mean, they're not that small. Now, these are the ones, she said, were not done with the aid of the masters. These were just her. And they're about evolution, of course. And what they're about, we really don't know. But they're between 1908 and they're big. I mean, they're 102 by 5 by 134. So this sort of size, really. But now, what the ladies said, and I have to say, this is not me, because I must. They saw, when we were talking about it on Tuesday, that a lot of these images refer to the atom, the women's bodies, like the vulva and.
Yes, they're kind of like sexualized,
yes,
or also kind of, I guess, describing male versus female.
Yes.
Yeah, kind of.
And I'll now tell you that in fact it was a young man, who told us, who he went to the exhibition with.
We went with a friend of ours.
We went with a friend, and you can tell him if you like, darling. You're better at this than I am.
Well, Paul and Frank are 2 good friends of ours who we usually go to see exhibitions with, and so it always provides for like really good dialogue and conversation afterwards. And whereas Pat and I kind of didn't think much of her work afterwards, it was him that was far more affected by it in the days later. And he said so much so that he was dreaming about it and sort of came to the realization by sort of remembering key bits of her work, like the geometry or the symbolism, that she was somehow speaking to the men or the kind of maleness by sort of showing the dynamic between men and women. And so he was actually recognizing the kind of
the seed. Do you remember he talked about the seed
sort of
all
like
the time.
The conch shell as a kind of origin point, the egg being inseminated by the sperm, all of these kind of like symbolisms that were subtly making their way into his brain.
But he found it very feminine, didn't he? He talked about that.
Very feminine, but also very much kind of like addressing a man as to what femininity is or what a woman is.
We thought this was interesting, so we thought we'd tell you, because I mean, this is not me at all. Okay, next
I
one.
think the message was kind of lost on us.
Look, here they are.
Yeah, so kind of like origin points,
Yes, you see.
centrality, emergence, birth,
Yes.
expansion, growth.
Basically seeds, aren't they?
Yeah.
Now, these are all done between 1915 and this one. It changes very slightly, a little bit here. These are what I showed you in the photograph, so you get an idea of the scale of them. They're really quite large. And the figure, again, you see the figure for the first time, really. And the swan becomes a symbol.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next one, you see the spiral we were talking about earlier. Okay, this seems to be a slightly different image to me. It seems to be much more sort of architectural almost. This last group, but they're all roughly the same. This particular lot really are going on until about they're 1916, 1915, 1916. Now the next one is the Tree of Knowledge. This is the W series. And these were done in 1913, 1915, between 1913 and 1915. And you do see here the images of birds and particular swans and sort of sperm and goodness knows what. And this particular group, this is ink on paper. The other ones we were looking at were oil, but these are watercolor. The size of these, they're 45 by 29. They're much smaller. There was something like 93 of these, and thousands of these watercolors left to her great nephew. Okay, next one. These are all between 1915, 1916, and they are all about 45 by 29, that sort of size, and they're all watercolor. And they've got writing all over them as well. Okay. I really can't really, I don't really sort of understand them particularly. I don't really know quite what to say about them, really. They're gouache on paper. And she was very, very much involved with this theosophical movement. And these dates, the next series is much later. Okay, next, and these again are oil paint. And these particular funny little houses, this is series 5, and they all come in these series. And this particular one is roughly 1920. And these are the ones that she took, well, the images, photographic images she took to show Steiner in Switzerland. But these particular ones are very large. These are in the exhibition, and they're extremely large. They're the dog group, and there's another little symbol which is 1X by UW, and these are sort of in 1926. This is 1917. This is 1919, and this is what he's talking about with the seed, which is in most of all of them. You find it in this one too. This is also called the dove. However, the next one was the one that these come from the real thing. So you've got here a detail, and this is the Camilla's photograph of it. And this is the swan, and this is big. This is 150 by 150. And this is a series from about 14 to 15. And these are the ones that were taken by her nephew and completely ignored by Stockholm. The next one too. Now this particular one comes from Camilla's photographs, so you get an idea of the quality of the paint. These are from books. This is from the photograph, but these two are from books. But look at the paint quality. They're very interesting, these. And again, they're oil paint. But this one, the spiral one, is strange. This is very large. It is in the last room, the last big room of her work. And this particular one is the UW series, and it's number 9. This one on the right is number 19, and this is 1915. Both of these are 1915. This is from a book, but this one comes from the real thing, so you get an idea of the paint quality. And it's much more painterly, you see. But the next one comes from the Guggenheim. I had to show you this because this is the altarpiece. These are one of 10 of the ones which are created by the master, you know. And she was just this is a Guggenheim one again, and this was the altarpiece group. This, I believe, are the ones that were shown at the Serpentine a little while ago. Well,
Yes.
You saw them.
It was
I didn't,
just her work.
I didn't see
Yeah.
that. I didn't see that exhibition. I'm sorry, I didn't.
But these are not, unfortunately, these aren't in the exhibition.
They're not in the
I think
exhibition,
these
are
would have
they?
been much more powerful.
They are very powerful, these. This, we've now gone back to Mondrian. We're seeing the development of Mondrian, which is so interesting. This is the composition in color B of 1917. He's back in France. These are very nice images because they come from the real thing. Look at the paint quality. The reason I'm telling you this, because these pictures, which look as if they were done very quickly, were done over and over and over again, quite often, painting one set of colors put on top of another set of colors, and you can see it more clearly in these. And this particular one, again, is him showing this interest in the color theories. He hasn't quite yet made up his mind about what he's going to be talking about. Next one. This is one of the most interesting. Again, this comes from the real thing. We're lucky to have this. I want you to look at this very carefully and look at these images, these tiny images. None of them are repetitive. They're all different. All of these tiny horizontals and verticals. Again, this is a detail. This is 1617. He is most extraordinary. At the time, he was involved, very much involved with when he did these, 1617. He was very much involved with the De Stil movement, and Bart van der Lek was very much part of it too. At this moment, they had a tremendous falling out. He and Doesberg had a falling out because he absolutely refused the idea of any diagonals, and Doesberg did painting with diagonals, and they didn't speak to each other afterwards. It's all very odd. But still, this was a quite firm decision that he'd made. And now we're going to see the development of Mondrian. These are marvelous. This is from the real thing. Look at this color. This is composition with red, blue, black, yellow, and grey of 1921. It's 39 by 35. And they quite extraordinary, these. And they're painted on colour on board. And they're painted back in France, of course. And now we're going to see, actually, Doesberg was a very, very good publicist. And this is still, he now had quite a firmly important reputation. And about now, in the middle of the 30s, he meets Nicholson and Hepworth. This is an astonishingly important meeting because in 1937, you remember, and his work was being shown a great deal in Germany. Hitler comes to power in 1933, and he puts up that huge decadent show in 1937, and there was something like 16 Mondrians in that show. And they were all sold for sort of, remember, they were all sold in Switzerland. And this is how they really began to be disseminated to America and all sorts of things. But the friendship with Nicholson and Hepworth is very, very important, because when the war starts, the Second World War starts, he comes to England for a short time, and he lives in Hampstead. But very sadly, there's a bomb dropped in a few streets, and he gets very, very nervous, and he finds there's a new young supporter of him, a man called Holtzman, and he actually arranges so that Mondrian could get on one of the troop ships that he goes to. It takes 2 weeks, I gather, this ship to get to New York, and of course he arrives in New York, where he's picked up by Peggy Guggenheim, as you know, and he becomes his methods suddenly change and become. There's a lot of yellow in it these, but this particular group we're looking at now, the next two are this. Can we go through next one? Let's do the next one, because these are from the real thing, and it's wonderful when you see the real thing. This composition of lines and color is 1937. This is about the time of the Nicholson friendship, and the one on the right is the composition with 8 lines and red, which is 1938. And the interesting thing, he makes these diagonals, and when he shows these pictures, he's also created the frames, and so you get the diagonal with the frame in these cases, these diagonal ones, and they are incredibly beautiful. Now at the end we've put this because I hope you can read it, because he calls this imagery neoplasticism, and he's now describing it. You see. I have to tell you that I was so impressed with this. It's the first time ever that I've seen, I think, well, you too, was it?
Well, one of the things, I don't know if you haven't mentioned it, but we had quite a lot of discussion before the exhibition and then afterwards.
Yes.
Kind of like keeping an open mind about Clint's work versus Mondrian. And then afterwards, we discussed quite a lot our own responses to Clint's work versus versus Mondrian, but we even sort of had a discussion with a friend of ours, Jeff, and I called it a cage match. So sort of like the way that the curators pitted Mondrian versus Clint, which ended up being quite unfair.
I think so, yes.
Jeff said leveraged, when sort of exhibitions leverage one artist versus another, or a collective of artists against each other. And so it's kind of a trope. We're probably desensitized to it, but what it really did reflect was that Clint's work is not, to my mind, I mean, I think I told you this, it's not meant for public consumption. It's very personal to her. It's very personal to her mind.
Yes.
And so she was working things out through notebooks, through exercises, trying to find the kind of meaning behind ratios and calculations and geometry and this like sort of finding a rationale to the spiritualism, whereas Mondrian was kind of painting with feeling towards what the viewer might experience or might see.
And remember, as I said, very important to remember about this, she was completely isolated, you see.
Right.
And I think that this is important. This is literally an isolation. She was seeing no work. The work she did actually go on a trip to Italy, but basically she was looking at the old masters.
So what you're saying there is that she was completely self-referential.
Absolutely.
Whereas Mondrian was working within a collective.
Completely. We're talking about the difference. This is why I think it was a ridiculous.
No, it's a cage match. It's leveraging one, which is simplistic and at the end banal, because you sort of realize you're not meant to understand Clint's work, whereas you do come away understanding Mondrian much more. So it's quite unfair to Clint in a way.
I may, to all of you, tell you now, you'll